Hi everyone, it's Paul Tilley and welcome to PR2170 Project Management. Today we're looking at Unit 3, Project Scope Management. The material for this particular unit can be found in Module 3, Project Scope Management, and covered in Chapter 4, Defining the Project. By the end of this unit, you will have a good understanding of the function of project scope management, and we're going to look at the main focus of each of the main processes of project scope management. We're going to explain scope planning process, we're going to discuss the purpose of scope management planning, and we're going to state the function of the work breakdown structure, which we'll look at in great detail. In Unit 1, if you recall, we talked about this idea of the triple constraint. And the triple constraint deals with scope, time, and cost. In this particular unit, we're looking at the issue of scope. So what exactly is scope? Scope really is the size of the project, and every project has to have a finite size. The reason is that if you're bidding on doing something, or if you're saying you'll get something completed, you want to know where the finish line is. What is it that you need to do in order to be successful? So determining scope is a critical part of any project management. What needs to be done? When does it need to be done? Who's going to do it? These are the key issues that scope looks at. Fortunately, there are a lot of project management tools that have been developed to help us determine the scope and manage the scope of a project, and we'll be looking at this unit as well. Managing the scope of a project is really challenging, and in order to get a good sense of how to resolve that problem, we have to understand some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about. First of all, project scope refers to all the work involved in creating a product or project and the processes that are used, the intermediate steps more or less, to create them. So we need to be able to consider what are the individual little pieces of our larger project. That's the first thing we need to be able to do. Secondly, we're talking about this concept of a deliverable. A deliverable is what the user, the end user, the person who has wanted us to do this project, what they get at the end. And we've got to think about, does it meet their needs, right? So the whole idea of a project is to make sure that deliverable meets their needs. Third, we need to think about scope management. And this is all about how do we manage that need? Because the need, as stated at the beginning, could change over time, or the need could evolve. Those things can throw off a project because what someone wanted versus what they get, we could see an ever-widening gap in that unless the project scope is clear from the beginning and we're clear on exactly what the deliverable is. In terms of scope management, what we really need to do is develop something called a scope management plan. And we need to determine, first of all, what are the requirements for that scope management plan. So that's one of the things we need to do. And again, just to kind of emphasize the point again, if we clarify the scope, it saves us a lot of time and effort doing things that we really didn't need to do or things that are outside of the scope. So, we can imagine that if we don't clearly understand what we need to do, we'll waste a lot of time doing unnecessary tasks. So our goal is to limit those tasks. So the basic gist of what we are looking at here is coming up with some idea of what the scope of the project is before we ever get into it. And really, that is called the defining project scope process. And really it has 5 key processes within it. We got to be able to collect exactly what is required. So we got to go out and talk to people to find out what's required. We then develop the scope of what is it we're going to do. Then we break down each of the components of what we're going to do, kind of step by step by step by step. This is called a work breakdown structure. And then we verify to make sure that that indeed meets the requirements, verifying the scope. And the rest of it is really just controlling. We need to make sure that we stay on course in the project to make sure we are going where we said we want it to go. Just to put some detail around that, the very first thing we need to do, is probably the most important thing, is to collect the the project requirements. And how do we figure this out? We are novices at the given project that we're dealing with. The nature of a project means that it's unique. And how can we get as much information as we can in order to kind of figure out all of those things that we need to do? Well, the very first thing we should do is talk or communicate with what we call subject matter experts. These are people who have done this sort of thing before, okay? So we got to ask them, what are the steps involved? What are the ropes to skip and the ropes to know, more or less? So we can do that through holding focus groups, group discussions, talking to stakeholders, one-on-one interviewing, this type of thing. Gets an idea of what people want, what people can provide, these sorts of issues. We can do it by questionnaires, surveys. We can do observation, watch people do their job. In the case of software, we can do like what's called prototyping, which trying out a small model, a smaller version. Out of that comes really a couple of potential documents. There are several potential documents or several potential document formats that come out. I'm just going to talk about two here, and really the first one is called a requirements management plan. And a requirements management plan is nothing more than a written document that lays out what's required. And it usually follows a general format, such as an introduction, what exactly is the project, the purpose of the project, the scope of the project, some terms are defined within the project. These sorts of things would be written into a document for everyone involving in the project to be aware of. An alternative to a kind of a report format is what's called the traceability matrix. And a traceability matrix is more of a spreadsheet, but effectively what it does is it breaks the project down into the basic requirements. So it lays out what the requirements are in kind of a matrix format, and then who's responsible for it, who's going to go out and get that information, be able to be the contact for it, these sorts of things, what the actual task is that need to be done, the deliverables that's going to come out of it, and who's going to make sure that it actually does what it says it's supposed to be, the verification. So this is kind of a similar type of approach, but in a more matrix type format. So whenever we are looking at a project, it's a one-of. We're doing it for someone, whether our own organization or someone else's organization. We need to, before we ever start anything, be clear on what we're doing and what the expectations are. So in those documents, whether we use a type of a document process or a matrix type of spreadsheet type process, we need to be able to clearly define in that and make sure the client agrees to these. We need to define these basic things. We need to develop a clear project scope description. What is it we're doing? When are we going to have it done by? How much is it going to cost? What is the basic expectation here? We also got to clearly define what the acceptance criteria. To what level does it need to be done? How much is the person looking for? What level of quality? What level of time? What level of color? These sorts of things. What is the acceptance criteria? We've got to give detailed information on all the deliverables. Here's what I'm going to do, A, B, C, and D. And we're going to establish project boundaries. This is not within our scope of project, for example. We need to clearly say, these are the things we're doing, these are not the things we're doing. And we need to put as much documentation out there in that basic document as possible so that we can always refer back to it and make sure that we've done what we promised we said we're going to do. One of the biggest challenges for project managers as you move into a project is the concept of scope creep. Scope creep means the project scope grows and grows and grows as the project moves along. And this means like it's no different than the goalpost being moved in a hockey game. You know, it really makes it challenging to meet a criteria that's always changing. So we've got to be very careful as a project manager to ensure that we do not have excessive scope creep that goes beyond the boundaries of what we originally agreed to. Now, if you start thinking about this, you say, well, you know, these projects can get really complicated, particularly big projects. So how can we manage scope and all these issues that we've just talked about if the project is really huge and complex? One of the best ways to manage a project is to break it down into its components. And the tool that is commonly used in order to do this is called a work breakdown structure. All a work breakdown structure does is it takes the project and it breaks it down into its subcomponents, right down to steps in the process that are individual tasks. And it lays them out in terms of the sequence, the time it's going to take, and who's going to do it. So that way we really have a clear understanding of what steps are required in order to complete the project. These work breakdown structures are the fundamental tool that we use in project management and particularly project management software. So you need to become very familiar with this concept of decomposing a project into its components to be able to build a work breakdown structure. The work breakdown structure flows naturally into this fourth step of verifying the project scope. Once we've got the work breakdown structure done, we have a clear indication of what we need to do and the various steps involved. We need to meet with the customer, the client, the organization, the person who needs this project completed. We sit down with them and we explain, here are all the things that need to be done. We seek acceptance at that point. It clearly defines in both parties' mind what's going to be done, how it's going to be done, how much it's going to cost to be done, and when it's going to be done. And this clearly lays out what the deliverable is going to be in everybody's mind. As the project begins and moves along, we move into the fifth process, which is controlling the project scope. And effectively, that ensures that what we said we're going to do is actually what we're doing. And it keeps it within the bounds that everyone agreed to. As the name suggests, a work breakdown structure breaks the project down into its subcomponents. And the basic idea is to take the overall work, the entire project, and break it down progressively into smaller and smaller chunks called decomposition until we end up with individual tasks or work packages that we can estimate sensibly and assign to various team members. So a work package is really a task at the lowest level of the work breakdown structure. So this is what we need to do today type thing. So a work breakdown structure is often depicted as a task-oriented family tree of activities or a flow chart, similar to an organizational chart. So a project team often organizes the work breakdown structure around project products, project phases, and using a project management process group and even project management software. To be able to put a finer point on that, let's look at the work breakdown. So let's look at an example of work breakdown structure for our software product release, okay? So, as I said, the breakdown structure is a deliverable-oriented grouping of work. Okay, let's take a look at this example right here. We've got a software product release that's coming up, and we think about what are some of the key things. Well, there's project management, the project requirements, the design, the construction, and the integration and testing. So those would be like the natural steps that project would have to flow through in order to be successful. So what we've done is we've taken each of those steps and we've broken them down even further into planning, meetings, administration, for example, or in the case of product requirements, software user documentation. So these are all what would be considered as sub parts or decomposed parts of the overall project that we could assign various people to in terms of tasks. We could visually represent this in a flowchart, and the flowchart would be a summary of all of the tasks. So for example, top level task, level 1, would be the internet project itself, which would flow into specific components, concept, web design, and so on. Level 3 would be even finer. Level 4 would be the individual work packages that would be put together for people in the organization or departments in the organization to complete as part of the overall project. Many organizations have processes in place in order to develop these type of charts. For example, large organizations like the military would have guidelines in place for how to build a work breakdown structure for some given project. Other organizations look at other projects or other organizations done similar things and basically copy from what they've done, which is really the analogy approach. Other organizations will take a very top level view and start breaking it out, whereas others will look at a bottom up point of view, look at all the tasks and work our way up towards the end product. An interesting approach that has been looked at in the last number of years is something called mind mapping, which is really a graphical technique that allows for organizations to brainstorm what needs to be done, who needs to be done, and these sorts of things. So if we look at an example of a mind map here, here's an example for remodeling a kitchen. And these are what comes of it are the various components. So for example, the floor, what kind of wood, how are we going to cut it? how we're going to make it even, how we're going to install. The work breakdown structure is only good as what people can understand of it, so we need to be able to develop some sort of an interpretation tool. The work breakdown structure dictionary is a useful interpretation tool. It provides details about the individual components of the structure, such as a description of each component, who's responsible for it, a statement of the work, critical milestones, preliminary estimates. So it's the fine detail that people are going to want to look at. So that is really the descriptors that come with the documentation. Let's take a few minutes to look at a tighter example of a work breakdown structure here. This is for building a website, let's say. Okay? Now, all of these work breakdown structures will follow a similar pattern. There are various levels, but the top level, that level 1, is the parent task. It is the actual project, what you are doing. And ultimately, the actual project meets the project objectives, to build a new website, for example. So we need to then flow into what's called level 2 tasks, which are dependencies of level 1. These level 2 tasks are really the things that we need to do in order to make level 1 happen. So think about a website. Before we actually build a website, we got to have a creative brainstorming session. We got to revamp the brand guidelines. We got to create messaging. We got to redesign the logo. We got to think about photography. All of these things need to be done in order to make that website happen. So this is a little more granular, a little more fine detail, but not really fine enough to say that this is a job for Sammy to do. Okay, we need to be able to kind of develop it even further into what we call level 3 or subdependencies, which are more subtasks. So in the third level, we break the dependencies down into manageable components called subdependencies. So at this stage, the lowest level of the project lifecycle, you're defining the most detailed tasks. These actionable tasks will simplify the path to get to that ultimate objective. So continuing the example, then we'd look at level 3 tasks, included for the new site design would include the brand colors that we need to choose, building a brand mood, assigning a designer, building mock-ups of design, reviewing the mock-ups, scheduling brand photo shoot, resizing and editing pictures. So each of these you can see are very detailed and very clear in terms of this is a project someone or some group can handle. The work breakdown structure dictionary for this particular example would include a bunch of things that would help clarify to anyone reading this document what exactly is going to be done. So it's created and it would give information with regards to the tasks, what needs to be done. It names them, clear and simple, gives descriptions of what each of those tasks would be, what the exact deliverables are, what the budget is going to be, what are some of the key milestones, the things that we need to meet, when we're going to meet them, who assigns the approvals, what the approvals would be required, the points that the approvals would be required. And it would also include a timeline. And the timeline is built in something called a Gantt chart. And all a Gantt chart does is it lays out the timing of each of the individual tasks relative to the date. So you can see it as set up as a matrix in this particular example here. And you can see, for example, planning will happen between then and then. Research will happen between a date and date, design, and so on. Some of those can overlap, meaning that they can go on at the same time. So planning and research can both occur at the same time. You notice that one overlaps the others, whereas others need to be completed before the next one can begin. So for example, design really needs to be almost clued up before implementation begins. So the Gantt chart is a good way to look at the overall project in terms of a timing perspective. So in summary, it's important to say that we have a clear understanding of what the project will entail. And in order to help us clarify that understanding, work breakdown structure is a useful tool to be able to break a project down into its subcomponents so that we can think about each of the individual tasks that will be required. That helps us better manage projects. So in the next video, take a look at the example of a work breakdown structure for a house build. As usual, if you have any questions, you let me know. Thanks for watching.